January 11th, 1989. Charles Bronson was sitting in his Malibu home when the phone rang. It was 3:47 in the morning. Nobody calls at 3:47 a.m. with good news. Charles had lived long enough to know that calls at that hour bring only one thing: devastation. He picked up the phone. The voice on the other end belonged to a detective from the Los Angeles Police Department. "Mr. Bronson, we need you to come to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. It's about your son, Jason." Charles didn't ask questions. He already knew, deep down, in that place where a father's worst fears live. He already knew Jason was dead, and the man who had survived coal mines, world wars, and decades of Hollywood rejection was about to face the one enemy he couldn't defeat: grief for a child lost to addiction. Most people don't know that Charles Bronson had an adopted son named Jason. The press rarely mentioned him. He wasn't part of the Hollywood machinery. He didn't attend premieres or pose for photographs. Jason McCallum Bronson lived quietly, almost invisibly, in the shadow of one of the world's biggest action stars. And that invisibility, that desire to be normal in a world that worshipped his father, may have been what killed him. Jason wasn't Charles Bronson's biological son. He was the son of Jill Ireland, Charles's wife, from her previous marriage to actor David McCallum. When Charles married Jill in 1968, he didn't just marry the woman he loved. He adopted her two sons, Jason Valentine, and raised them as his own. Charles Bronson, the man whose entire life had been defined by survival and toughness, became a father, and not just any father, a devoted one. Friends said Charles treated Jason and Valentine exactly like he treated his biological children. There was no distinction, no favoritism. They were his sons. Period. Jason was born in 1963, 5 years before Charles and Jill married. By the time he was a teenager in the late 1970s, Jason was living in a world most kids could only dream about. His stepfather was Charles Bronson, one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. His mother, Jill Ireland, was a successful actress. They lived in beautiful homes, traveled the world, attended glamorous events. From the outside, it looked perfect, but inside, Jason was struggling. He was a sensitive kid, artistic, introspective. He didn't fit the mold of what people expected from Charles Bronson's son. He wasn't tough. He wasn't aggressive. He was gentle, quiet, almost fragile. And in Hollywood, fragility is seen as weakness. By his late teens, Jason had started experimenting with drugs. It began small: marijuana, pills, things that seemed harmless at the time. But by the early 1980s, Jason had moved on to harder substances: cocaine, heroin, the drugs that don't let go once they sink their claws in. Charles and Jill noticed. How could they not? Jason was disappearing before their eyes, losing weight, becoming distant, erratic. They tried everything: interventions, rehab programs, therapy. Charles, a man who had survived by sheer willpower, couldn't understand why Jason couldn't just stop, just quit, just choose to be strong. But addiction doesn't work that way. It doesn't care about willpower. It doesn't care who your father is or how much money you have. It just consumes. In 1984, the Bronson family faced another crisis. Jill Ireland was diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis was devastating. Jill was only 48 years old, vibrant, full of life, and now she was facing a battle that would consume the next 6 years of her life. Charles became her caretaker, her protector. He put his career on hold. He turned down roles. He stayed by her side through surgeries, chemotherapy, radiation. For a man who had spent his life being tough, Charles Bronson showed the world what real strength looked like. It wasn't about violence or revenge. It was about sitting in a hospital room, holding your wife's hand and refusing to leave. But while Charles was focused on Jill's battle, Jason was losing his own. The drugs had taken over completely. Jason was in and out of rehab facilities. He would get clean for a few weeks, sometimes a few months, and then relapse. Each time he relapsed, he went deeper. The drugs became stronger. The gaps between rehab stays became shorter. Charles felt helpless. He was a man who had spent his entire life solving problems through action, through strength. But he couldn't punch addiction in the face. He couldn't intimidate it. He couldn't will it away. All he could do was watch his son disappear. In the late 1980s, Jason was living in a small apartment in Los Angeles. Charles and Jill were paying his rent, giving him money for food, trying to keep him stable. But they also knew that some of that money was going to drugs. It was an impossible situation. If they cut him off completely, Jason might end up homeless, desperate. If they kept helping him, they were enabling his addiction. There was no right answer. Every choice felt wrong. Jason tried. Friends who knew him said he genuinely wanted to get clean. He talked about going back to school, about starting over, about making his parents proud. But addiction is a liar. It whispers promises it never keeps. It tells you that you can use just one more time, that you have control, that tomorrow you'll quit for real. And Jason believed those lies because what else could he do? The alternative was facing the crushing weight of reality, that he was losing a battle he didn't know how to fight. January 10th, 1989. Jason was alone in his apartment. He had been clean for 3 weeks. 3 weeks isn't much, but for someone in Jason's situation, 3 weeks felt like a lifetime. He was proud. He had called his mother the day before and told her he was doing better. Jill, still fighting her own battle with cancer, had cried tears of relief. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time Jason would make it. But that night, something happened. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was just the overwhelming weight of trying to stay clean in a world that felt too heavy to carry. Jason made a decision. Just one more time. Just to take the edge off. Just to feel okay for a little while. He called his dealer. The dealer came over. Jason bought heroin. And then he did something that killed him. After 3 weeks of being clean, Jason's tolerance had dropped. The dose he used to take, the dose that used to make him feel good, was now lethal. He injected the heroin, and within minutes, his body shut down, his breathing slowed, his heart rate dropped, and alone in that apartment, with no one there to call for help, Jason McCallum Bronson died. He was 27 years old. The coroner's report would later state that Jason died of acute heroin intoxication. In other words, an overdose. But that clinical language doesn't capture what really happened. Jason didn't die because of heroin. He died because addiction is a disease that nobody understood how to treat in 1989. He died because shame and stigma kept people from talking about drug abuse openly. He died because he was fighting a battle alone. Even though he was surrounded by people who loved him, Charles Bronson arrived at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. At 4:30 a.m., Jill was with him. They were taken to a private room where a doctor delivered the news they already knew but couldn't accept. Your son is dead. We did everything we could, but he was already gone when the paramedics arrived. Charles didn't cry. Not then. He just stood there, silent, his face carved from stone. Jill collapsed. She screamed. She sobbed. But Charles just stood there, absorbing the blow the way he'd absorbed every blow in his life. Silently, internally, letting it shatter him from the inside. The funeral was private. No press. No photographers. Just family and a few close friends. Jason was buried in a quiet cemetery in Los Angeles. Charles stood at the graveside wearing a black suit, sunglasses hiding his eyes. He didn't give a eulogy. He couldn't. He just stood there, staring at the coffin, trying to understand how he had survived so much coal mines, war, poverty, only to lose his son to something as invisible and cruel as addiction. After the funeral, Charles Bronson changed. Friends noticed it immediately. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He had always been a private person, but now he was almost reclusive. He stopped doing interviews. He turned down most film offers. When he did work, it was purely mechanical. He showed up, did his job, and went home. The spark that had made him a star, that intensity, that presence, was gone. He was going through the motions of living, but he wasn't really alive anymore. But here's the part that most people don't know. The part that reveals who Charles Bronson really was beneath the tough guy persona. After Jason's death, Charles quietly started donating large sums of money to drug rehabilitation centers. He didn't announce it. He didn't hold press conferences. He just wrote checks. Hundreds of thousands of dollars over the next decade. He funded treatment programs for people who couldn't afford them. He paid for halfway houses. He supported organizations that work with families affected by addiction. Charles also did something even more private. He started visiting rehab centers, not as a celebrity, not for publicity. He would show up unannounced, ask to speak to the residents, and tell them his story. He told them about Jason. He told them about his own failures as a father. He told them that he didn't have the answers, but he knew that they were worth fighting for. Counselors at these facilities later said that Charles Bronson saved lives, not because he was famous, but because he was honest. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He was just a father who had lost his son and didn't want other families to go through the same pain. One counselor at a Los Angeles rehab facility remembered Charles visiting in 1991. He said, Charles sat in a circle with about 15 young men and women, all of them struggling with heroin addiction. He didn't lecture them. He didn't tell them to just be strong. He told them that addiction was a disease, not a moral failing. He told them that his son had fought as hard as he could, but the disease won. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, Jason was stronger than me. He fought an enemy I never had to face. I'm proud of him for fighting, even though he lost. And I'm proud of you for being here, for trying. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Charles never talked about this publicly. When reporters asked him about his personal life, he shut down. He refused to discuss Jason's death. He refused to turn his son's tragedy into a headline, but in private, away from the cameras. Charles Bronson was doing something quietly heroic. He was trying to save other people's children because he couldn't save his own. Jill Ireland, still battling cancer, was also deeply affected by Jason's death. She became an advocate for addiction awareness. She wrote about it in her autobiography. She spoke about it in interviews, using her platform to break the stigma around drug addiction. She wanted the world to know that addiction doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, famous or unknown. It just takes. And it took her son. In 1990, just a year after Jason's death, Jill Ireland lost her battle with cancer. She died on May 18, 1990, at the age of 54. Charles Bronson, who had already lost his son, now lost his wife. The two people he loved most in the world were gone within 16 months of each other. For most people, that kind of loss would be unbearable. For Charles, it was a final blow. He didn't break down publicly. He didn't cry in front of cameras. But those who knew him said he was never the same. He was a ghost, walking through life but not really living it. Charles continued to work sporadically through the 1990s, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He appeared in a few direct-to-video action films, low-budget productions that barely got released. Critics said he looked tired, worn out. They were right. He was exhausted, not physically, but spiritually. He had spent his entire life fighting, and he was tired of fighting. In his final years, Charles Bronson lived quietly. He remarried in 1998 to Kim Weeks, a former employee who had worked for him and Jill. It was a simple ceremony. No fanfare. Just two people seeking comfort in a world that had been cruel to them both. Charles spent his days at home, watching old westerns, reading, and occasionally seeing friends. He rarely talked about Jason or Jill. The pain was too deep, too raw, even years later. On August 30th, 2003, Charles Bronson died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause of death was pneumonia, but really, he died of a broken heart. He died because he lost too much, survived too much, and carried too much pain for too long. He was 81 years old. He had outlived his son by 14 years. And those 14 years have been a prison of grief. At Charles Bronson's funeral, one of the speakers was a counselor from a drug rehabilitation center in Los Angeles. He stood at the podium and told a story that few people in attendance had heard. He talked about Charles's quiet visits to the facility. He talked about the lives Charles had saved. And then he said, Charles Bronson was a movie star. He played heroes on screen. But the real heroism was what he did when nobody was watching. He couldn't save Jason. That haunted him every day. but he saved dozens of other sons and daughters. He gave them hope when they had none. He gave them a reason to keep fighting. That's the Charles Bronson I'll remember. The tragedy of Jason's death is that it was preventable. In 1989, the understanding of addiction as a disease was still limited. Rehab programs were often ineffective. There was stigma around seeking help. Families like the Bronsons were told to use tough love, to cut off their addicted children, to force them to hit rock bottom. But rock bottom for many people is death. Jason hit rock bottom in a lonely apartment with no one there to save him. Today, we know more about addiction. We know it's a disease that requires medical treatment, not moral judgment. We know that support, not shame, is what saves lives. We know that families need resources, not blame. But in 1989, none of that understanding existed, and Jason paid the price. Charles Bronson's story is a reminder that toughness doesn't protect you from heartbreak, that fame and fortune don't shield you from loss, that even the strongest men can be broken by grief. Charles survived coal mines where men died daily. He survived a world war. He survived poverty, rejection, and decades of struggle. But he couldn't survive losing his son. That was the one battle he couldn't win. Jason McCallum Bronson is buried in a quiet cemetery in Los Angeles. His gravestone is simple. No mention of his famous parents. Just his name, his dates, and a single line, "Beloved son." Charles Bronson visited that grave regularly until his health prevented him from going. He would stand there alone, talking to Jason, apologizing, promising to do better, wishing he could trade places. The story of Charles Bronson and Jason isn't just a tragedy. It's a lesson. It's a reminder that addiction destroys families, even strong ones, that silence and shame kill people, that asking for help isn't weakness, it's survival, and that sometimes the toughest thing you can do isn't fighting. It's admitting that you need help. It's being vulnerable. It's allowing yourself to grieve. Charles Bronson spent his entire life playing tough guys on screen, men who didn't cry, who didn't break, who solved every problem with violence. But in real life, Charles Bronson learned that real strength isn't about violence. It's about love. It's about showing up for people even when you're falling apart. It's about continuing to fight even when you've already lost. Jason didn't survive his battle with addiction, but because of his death, Charles Bronson helped others survive theirs, and that, in its own heartbreaking way, is a legacy worth remembering. If you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, please reach out. Call a helpline, find a support group, talk to someone. Jason's story didn't have to end the way it did, and yours doesn't either. Charles Bronson couldn't save his son, but maybe, just maybe, his story can save someone else's.